The city lights of New York glittered beneath the midnight sky, casting a soft glow across the streets as Sandra Bullock's limo pulled up to the grand entrance of the annual charity gala. She glanced out the window, taking in the sight of the towering skyscrapers and the sea of glamorous people spilling out of limousines and taxis. The event was the talk of the town, a mix of Hollywood A-listers and Manhattan's elite, a place where reputations were built and shattered in the blink of an eye. Sandra had been invited last minute, her name appearing on the guest list just a day before, and now she was second-guessing everything. The sleek black car came to a stop, and the door opened. Her stiletto heels clicked against the pavement as she stepped out, the sound echoing in the cool night air. The moment her foot hit the ground, flashes of light from the paparazzi cameras went off, blinding her for a moment. She straightened her dress, an elegant silver number that hugged her frame, and put on a smile that felt a little too forced. "Welcome to the circus," she muttered under her breath. Inside, the ballroom was even more opulent than she had imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, reflecting the light in dazzling patterns. The chatter of socialites mingling, glasses of champagne clinking, and the soft hum of a string quartet filled the space, but Sandra felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had never been a fan of these kinds of events. Too many people pretending to be someone they weren't, too many fake smiles and whispered judgments. "Do you think Sandra Bullock still has it?" she overheard one woman say, her voice loud enough to carry across the room. Sandra froze mid-step, feeling the words sting before she even turned her head. They hadn't noticed her yet, but the snide remark made her blood run cold. For a moment, she thought about turning around and walking right back out the door. But she couldn't. She wasn't the kind of person to back down. Not now, not in front of them. She took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders, forcing a calm smile as she made her way deeper into the crowd. There were more eyes on her now. The clicks of cameras grew louder, and whispers of curiosity filled the air. She wasn't sure what she was doing here. She had enough accolades, enough experience, enough fame, but in a room full of people who lived for status and appearance, all that felt meaningless. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The voice inside her mind broke through the noise, reminding her that this was more than just a charity event. It was a chance to show everyone that she wasn't just the girl from The Proposal or Gravity. She was more than what they saw on screen. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in one of the polished glass walls and adjusted her hair. But deep down, she knew that no amount of makeup or designer gowns could shield her from the judgment she was about to face. A sudden chill ran down her spine. Was she prepared for what was to come? Just then, as she walked further into the crowd, Sandra spotted a familiar face, one that made her heart skip a beat. But it wasn't the socialites that caught her attention. No, it was the quiet, unassuming man standing at the bar, his eyes scanning the room like he was a little out of place too. Keanu Reeves. Her breath caught. Sandra had met him only briefly a few times, but there was something calming about him, something grounded. In that moment, he wasn't a movie star, he was just another person who seemed as out of place in this world as she felt. And as she moved closer to him, unaware of the growing tension in the air, she had no idea that this night was about to take a dramatic turn. What started as just another fancy gala was going to turn into something neither of them could have predicted. The whispers grew louder. Sandra wasn't the only one being judged. Something was shifting in the room, and she didn't even know it yet. As Sandra made her way through the sea of chatter, she couldn't help but feel like a fish out of water. The glamorous socialites in their pristine gowns and tailored suits exchanged polite but hollow pleasantries, each one sizing up the other. It was all about appearances, as if nothing else mattered. She had done this countless times before, walked these red carpets, smiled through the fake conversations, but tonight felt different. The air was thicker, and the eyes on her seemed sharper. She could hear bits and pieces of their conversations as she passed by, the whispers slithering through the room like poison. She used to be in everything, but now. I don't know. Is she still relevant? One woman in a sequin dress muttered to her companion. The words hit harder than they should have. Sandra tried to ignore them, but the subtle undercurrents of judgment started to take their toll. She straightened her back and pasted on a smile. She had played this game before, but tonight it felt like everyone was watching with an expectation to fail. At that moment, a well-known socialite named Claire, a former actress turned fashion mogul, stepped up beside Sandra, giving her a quick hug. "Sandra, darling, you look absolutely stunning," Claire gushed, though there was something in her eyes that made Sandra uneasy. "But, tell me, how's your relevance these days? Still getting offers? Or has the industry moved on?" Sandra forced a laugh, a little too high-pitched for her liking. "Oh, you know how it is. The industry's always moving forward," she replied, her voice steady, though a part of her wanted to flee. She'd been asked questions like this before, but never so openly or so maliciously. She could feel the eyes of the room turn to her, waiting for her to crack under the pressure. "Relevance?" Another voice joined in, this time from across the room. A man she didn't recognize, but who seemed to be enjoying the attention he was getting. She used to be in the spotlight all the time, but now? Who even remembers her latest films? Did they even get a wide release? The comment was like a dagger thrown with precision. Sandra froze, a tight knot forming in her stomach. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the sting of their words hitting her heart. The socialites gathered around her began to chuckle, exchanging knowing glances. It wasn't just one insult now, it was a coordinated attack. The roast was on, and Sandra was their target. Her mind raced. What should she do? She was an experienced actress, used to the spotlight and the pressure, but this felt different. It wasn't just about her career anymore, it was about her worth as a person. She wanted to snap back, to throw a cutting remark of her own, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the realization that no matter what she said, they'd just twist it into something else. But just as she opened her mouth to respond, another voice interrupted her. Calm, steady, and strangely familiar. "I think what you're missing," Keanu Reeves' voice rang out from the corner of the room, "is that relevance isn't about what others think. It's about doing what you love, not chasing some fleeting moment of fame." Sandra turned, startled to see him standing there, his quiet presence filling the room in a way the others' loud voices never could. He wasn't here for the drama, not for the cameras or the ego trips that plagued the event. He was just here. The room fell silent. Sandra's heart skipped a beat. Was this real? Was Keanu Reeves really stepping in to defend her? Claire, the same socialite who had just insulted Sandra, blinked in confusion. "Keanu, darling," she said, her tone shifting from dismissive to flirtatious in a heartbeat, "I didn't realize you were a fan of Sandra's work." Keanu's gaze was calm, almost serene, as he replied, "I'm a fan of people who speak their truth, Claire. And Sandra's always done that. You should try it sometime." The crowd's reaction was immediate. Some gasped, others laughed nervously, unsure of how to handle the sudden shift in the mood. Sandra could feel the tension in the air, but for the first time that night, she felt a sense of relief. Keanu's words weren't just a defense for her, they were a reminder that she didn't need to prove herself to anyone. The socialites, however, were not backing down easily. Claire's lips curled into a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Keanu," she said with a mock sigh. "Always the hero. But you know, even heroes have their limits." Sandra could feel her hands begin to sweat. She was used to being the center of attention, but not like this, not when every word she spoke felt like it would be twisted into something it wasn't. She could see the socialites rallying, each one taking their turn to throw barbs. Claire, the man from earlier, and a few others started to pile on, questioning her career choices, her relationships, even her looks. Each insult felt like a weight on her chest, but she reminded herself, this was just a game to them. They were playing with her, testing her resolve. The question was, could she endure it? But before she could gather her thoughts, Keanu took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Claire. "You've had your fun, Claire," he said firmly, his voice unshaken. "But here's a reality check for you. Sandra doesn't need to prove anything to you. She's been through more than you can ever imagine, and she's still standing. Maybe you should learn something from that." The room went completely still. Keanu's words hung in the air, the final strike against the socialites' bravado. Sandra could feel her confidence begin to rebuild, a small but growing flame of defiance. This wasn't just about her career anymore, it was about her dignity. And with Keanu's unexpected support, she wasn't backing down. As Claire's face flushed red and the murmurs started to die down, Sandra finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Thanks, Keanu. But I think I can handle this." She turned away from the group, her heart still pounding but her resolve stronger than ever. This was just the beginning, there was more to come, and she was ready. But what neither Sandra nor anyone else in the room knew was that Keanu's intervention was about to change everything. This wasn't going to end like the socialites expected. As Sandra stepped away from the socialite circle, she felt a strange mix of emotions. The sharp sting of their insult still lingered in her chest, but Keanu's defense had given her a lifeline. Her hands, which had once been trembling, were now steady, her mind sharpening with clarity. She had come here to face the world, maybe even her own insecurities, and now, with Keanu Reeves by her side, she wasn't sure what this night would become. But she wasn't going to let them control the narrative. She could hear the whispers beginning to ripple through the room again, but this time, they weren't about her. Instead, they were about Keanu, who had just come to her defense. He wasn't known for making bold statements, and that made his sudden intervention even more powerful. People were starting to take notice, but the question was, why? What had made him stand up for her so suddenly? Was there more to this story than the world was seeing? Keanu, as calm and collected as ever, had already slipped back into the crowd. It wasn't about making a scene or seeking attention. It was clear that he wasn't here for any of that. He was simply being Keanu. But for Sandra, the night was no longer just about surviving this gala. It was about facing something deeper. She found herself instinctively gravitating toward the bar, her hands seeking the comfort of a glass of champagne. She needed a moment to collect herself before returning to the madness of the night. As she took a seat on one of the plush velvet stools, she caught sight of a familiar figure walking toward her. It was the man who had been throwing the sharpest barbs her way earlier, a man who, under normal circumstances, would have been just another face in the crowd. But now, the smile he wore was far from friendly. It was smug, almost predatory. "Miss Bullock," he greeted, his tone dripping with feigned politeness, "I didn't mean to offend earlier. You know how these things go. The pressure to impress, the competition, it's all a little intense." Sandra raised an eyebrow, wondering if this was some sort of backhanded apology or if he was simply trying to save face after Keanu's intervention. "Oh, I'm sure you didn't mean it," she replied with a tight smile, her voice carrying the same veneer of politeness. "But it's not about me, is it? You're just trying to get ahead. It's always been about you, hasn't it?" The man's smile faltered for a split second, but it quickly returned, even more insistent this time. "What's your point, Sandra?" "I was just stating the obvious. The world moves on, you know. It's business. You can't expect to be a star forever." Before Sandra could respond, a voice from behind her interrupted the conversation. "I think you've said enough." It was Keanu again, his calm presence stepping into the tension like a shield. Sandra turned in surprise, but the man before her didn't even flinch. Keanu's eyes were cold, his earlier warmth now replaced by something more guarded. The man, who had been trying so hard to provoke Sandra, seemed to shrink under Keanu's gaze. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I didn't mean to make things uncomfortable. I'll leave you two alone." With that, he quickly retreated, disappearing into the crowd before Sandra could say another word. She was left there, still feeling the weight of the moment, but now with Keanu standing beside her, like a steady anchor in the storm. "I didn't ask for your help again," Sandra said quietly, still a little stunned by how quickly he'd come to her defense. Keanu gave her a soft smile, almost apologetic. "You didn't have to. You've been carrying that weight alone long enough, Sandra. Sometimes it's just about knowing someone's got your back, even if you don't ask for it." There was something about his words that made her heart swell with emotion, a mix of gratitude and a deep sense of relief. She had always been the one to help others, the one who kept it together when everything felt like it was falling apart. But in that moment, she realized how much she needed someone, anyone, to see her for more than just the character she portrayed on the big screen. She glanced around the room, and for the first time that night, the socialites didn't feel like her enemy. They didn't even matter anymore. The whispers, the judgments, they were just noise, distractions from what really mattered. "Thank you, Keanu," Sandra said, her voice quieter now, more sincere. "I don't know why you did it, but it means more than you know." Keanu shrugged slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "Maybe it's because I know what it's like to be underestimated. Or maybe it's just because you deserve better than that." Sandra smiled, her heart lightening. She didn't need their approval, didn't need the validation from the people in this room. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't here to prove herself to anyone, and neither was Keanu. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of half-hearted conversations and polite smiles. The socialites who had once targeted her seemed less confident now, their jabs falling flat as they realized that Sandra Bullock wasn't going to crumble under their scrutiny. Keanu's quiet, unwavering presence beside her had turned the tables in a way that no one could have predicted. As the night wore on, Sandra finally felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of freedom. The weight of trying to please everyone had lifted. She wasn't here to be their punching bag, to play the role they wanted her to play. She was here to simply exist, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the final speeches were made, Sandra stood at the edge of the room, gazing out over the glittering skyline of New York. The city seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. And for the first time tonight, Sandra realized it wasn't about what anyone else expected. She had come here to face herself, to confront the expectations, and to remind herself that, no matter what, she was more than their judgments. Keanu stood next to her, his quiet presence a grounding force in the chaotic world around them. Neither of them spoke, but in that silence, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual understanding that the night had changed both of their lives, even if they hadn't fully realized it yet. They were no longer just two people standing in a room full of judgment, they were two people who had found the courage to be exactly who they were, without apology. As the night drew to a close, the once glittering ballroom now felt more like a haze of indistinct voices and muted laughter. The luxuriousness of it all, the silk, the sequins, the champagne, seemed less impressive with each passing hour. Sandra found herself standing by the grand windows, her eyes fixed on the sprawling city beneath. The gala had started out as a night of superficial charm and false pleasantries. But in that moment, with the cool night air brushing against her skin and the chaos of the party fading into the background, Sandra realized that this event was far more significant than she'd ever imagined. Not just because of the confrontation with the socialites or Keanu's unexpected support, but because it had awakened something in her. A need to reclaim her own narrative. Keanu's voice broke her from her thoughts. "I'm sorry," he said, standing beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his blazer. "I didn't mean to intrude on your night. I just, couldn't stand seeing you get ripped apart like that." Sandra smiled at him, a small, genuine smile. "You didn't intrude. You did what I couldn't. And for that, I'm grateful." Keanu's gaze softened. "I don't think it's fair for anyone to assume they know you, Sandra. People think they have the right to judge, to make you fit into some mold. But you've never been that person. You've always been the one who broke the mold." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Sandra felt a deep sense of truth settle in her chest. She had spent so many years trying to conform to what people expected from her, the romantic comedies, the dramatic roles, the ever-smiling persona. She had tried to fit in, but it had always felt like she was stretching herself too thin. And now, as she stood next to Keanu, she realized just how much of herself she had lost in the process. The room was beginning to empty, the sounds of chatter gradually fading into the distance. It was clear that the night was winding down, but Sandra wasn't ready to leave, not yet. There was something about the quiet moment she shared with Keanu, something that felt more real than anything she had encountered all evening. "You know," Sandra said, her voice quiet, "for years, I've been chasing the next big thing. The next role, the next project, the next, everything. But I feel like I've been losing myself in the process." Keanu looked at her, his expression understanding. "You're not alone in that. I think everyone gets caught up in the noise at some point. We all think we need to keep running, to stay in the game, to prove we're still worth something. But what happens when the noise fades? What's left?" The question echoed in Sandra's mind, reverberating through her like a wake-up call. She had spent so much of her life trying to meet everyone's expectations. She had built a career based on what others thought she should do, never fully embracing who she was beyond the roles she played. She had been chasing the wrong things. Sandra turned toward Keanu, her eyes meeting his. "So what now? What's left for me, if not the fame or the roles?" Keanu's eyes softened, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Now," he said, "it's about doing things on your own terms. If you really want to break free from the noise, you have to start living for yourself, not for them. You're not defined by the parts you play. You're defined by who you choose to be. And that's a freedom most people never get to experience." Sandra nodded slowly, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within her. She had spent so much of her life under the pressure of other people's expectations, but in this moment, surrounded by the fading lights and the remnants of the gala, she felt a shift, a change that had been a long time coming. "Thank you, Keanu," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I needed to hear that." Keanu gave a small shrug. "I think we all need to hear it every once in a while. It's easy to forget who we really are when the world is constantly telling us who they want us to be." Sandra looked out at the city once more, the skyline stretching before her like a never-ending horizon. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of clarity. She didn't have to keep running. She didn't have to keep fighting for approval. Her heart was finally at peace with the idea that she could step back, take control of her own path, and do things for herself. But before she could say anything more, Keanu broke the silence once more. "You don't have to decide everything tonight, Sandra. But when you're ready, whatever you choose, I'll be there." His words struck a chord within her. It wasn't about making a big decision in that moment. It was about allowing herself the space to figure things out, to breathe and reflect on everything that had led her here. She didn't need to have all the answers right away. For the first time in a long time, Sandra felt the freedom to simply be. As the night grew quieter and the last of the guests filtered out of the ballroom, Sandra and Keanu remained by the window, not saying anything, but understanding everything. The night had started with judgment and cruelty, but it had ended with something far more meaningful, the chance to rediscover herself, to redefine her journey on her own terms. And as the final moments of the gala drew to a close, Sandra made a promise to herself that she would no longer be defined by the noise, the judgment, or the expectations of others. She was going to carve out a path that was entirely her own. But as the night faded into the early morning hours, she knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The night had settled into its quiet aftermath, but Sandra's thoughts were anything but still. As the last of the guests trickled out, the lights in the ballroom dimmed and the echoes of laughter faded into the distance. She and Keanu stood there for a while longer, the weight of their conversation lingering between them like a soft hum. The world outside the ballroom was vast and unpredictable, but for the first time that evening, Sandra didn't feel like she had to face it alone. Keanu stepped back from the window, his hands still tucked in his pockets. The atmosphere had shifted, and though there was a quiet understanding between them, Sandra could sense that there was more Keanu wanted to say. He had opened a door, one that led to a space where honesty and vulnerability could finally exist, but Sandra wasn't sure if she was ready to walk through it just yet. So, Sandra said, turning slightly to face him, "What happens now?" "The night is practically over." Keanu glanced back at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke softly. "It's not over, Sandra. Not for either of us. We're still here, still standing. And maybe that's the real beginning." Sandra's heart skipped a beat. There was something in his voice, something that hinted at deeper emotions that hadn't been fully explored. It was as if Keanu was searching for something, answers, perhaps. But his words weren't just about the night, they were about something bigger, something unspoken between them. Her breath hitched as she found herself searching his eyes, feeling a spark of vulnerability that mirrored her own. Sandra had spent years building walls, trying to keep the world from seeing the parts of her that felt exposed, fragile. But with Keanu, the walls felt less necessary. For once, she felt like she didn't have to protect herself. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," Sandra admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I've spent my whole life trying to be something everyone else wanted me to be, and I've lost track of who I really am in the process." Keanu's gaze softened, and for the first time, Sandra noticed the weight in his eyes. It wasn't pity, but understanding. He wasn't judging her, he was simply seeing her for who she truly was. And it was a feeling she hadn't realized she needed until this very moment. "You're not alone in that," Keanu said gently. "I've been there too. It's easy to lose yourself when everyone around you has their own idea of who you should be." Sandra's pulse quickened. She felt as if something inside of her was on the verge of breaking open, something that had been buried for years. There was a pain in his words, a rawness that connected them in a way words couldn't fully explain. It was as though Keanu had lived through the same kind of internal struggle she had, but he wasn't afraid to face it. He had allowed himself to break free from the expectations of others, to be more than just a character on a screen. "Keanu," she whispered, the weight of his presence and his words enveloping her. "You've always seemed so at peace. How did you do it? How did you let go of the pressure?" For a moment, Keanu didn't answer. His eyes seemed distant, as if he were reliving something painful from his past. Then, his gaze met hers again, and for the first time, Sandra saw the quiet intensity behind his calm demeanor. It was like peeling back a layer of him she hadn't realized existed until now. "I didn't always have it figured out," Keanu said softly, his voice carrying a hint of sadness. "But I learned that peace doesn't come from living up to other people's expectations. It comes from being honest with yourself, no matter how hard that might be. I spent so many years trying to fit into a mold, to be the perfect version of myself for the world. But in the end, that's not who I am. I had to learn to accept that, accept myself, flaws and all." Sandra felt her throat tighten. The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability he had allowed himself to show, was something she hadn't expected. It was a side of him that the world rarely saw, Keanu Reeves, the beloved actor, the quiet enigma. But here, in this moment, he was simply a man who had battled his own demons, someone who had come out the other side stronger and more self-aware. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to do that," Sandra confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "To let go of all the expectations, the judgments, and just be myself." Keanu stepped closer, his presence soothing, as if he were offering her not just his words but his strength. "You don't have to do it alone, Sandra. You're not the only one who's felt like they were losing themselves in the noise. And I think that's why I'm here. I'm here to remind you that you don't have to keep carrying that burden. Not anymore." The air between them felt charged now, an unspoken connection building with each passing second. Sandra's heart raced, and she realized that the emotions she had been suppressing, emotions she had buried under the weight of her career, her public persona, were finally bubbling to the surface. She wasn't just grateful for Keanu's words, she was moved by the depth of his understanding. It was as if, in this moment, they had both shared something that was too real, too raw for the world to see. Keanu took another step forward, and for the first time that night, their proximity felt charged with something more. His eyes locked onto hers, and there was a softness in his expression that Sandra hadn't expected. There was no pretense, no games. It was just, real. "I've never been good at this," he said with a small, self-deprecating smile, "but I think I owe you more than just words. You've been through a lot, Sandra. And you deserve to be seen for who you really are. No more masks. No more expectations." Sandra's heart fluttered, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of release. All of the walls she had built, all of the expectations she had tried to meet, suddenly seemed so far away. There was no judgment here. No pressure to be anything other than who she truly was. In that quiet, pivotal moment, Sandra realized that this wasn't just about the gala, the socialites, or even the endless demands of Hollywood. It was about finding the courage to live authentically, to strip away the layers she had built up for years. And maybe, just maybe, it was about letting herself be seen, not just by Keanu, but by herself. And as they stood there, the weight of the night settling around them, Sandra felt like something inside her had finally clicked into place. The truth, the rawness, the vulnerability, she had never felt more alive. And as Keanu took one more step toward her, she realized that this wasn't just a turning point. It was the beginning of something deeper, a journey that would change both of their lives forever. The days following the gala were a blur for Sandra. She had returned to her everyday routine, the bustling studio, the constant stream of emails, the flashing lights of paparazzi, but something had shifted inside her. The noise that once dominated her world, the endless cycle of roles and expectations, seemed distant now. What had once been important felt inconsequential. She found herself thinking back to that pivotal moment with Keanu, the quiet conversation that had unraveled years of pent-up emotions. She had never expected to open up like that, not to him, and not to herself. But in those few moments, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't had in years. The chains she had been wearing, expectations, judgments, self-doubt, felt looser, easier to manage. She was finally breathing without feeling like she was drowning in it all. Sandra decided it was time for a change. Keanu had offered her something that night she hadn't known she needed, a reminder of who she truly was, without the spotlight. Without the constant pull to please others. He had opened the door to freedom, and she was ready to step through. For the first time, Sandra allowed herself to take a step back from her career. She didn't sign up for the next project immediately. Instead, she sought balance, something she had never truly given herself the space to do before. She spent time alone, rediscovered the things she loved before the fame, painting, reading, hiking. For the first time in a long time, she felt like herself again. But even with all this newfound space for reflection, there were moments when Sandra's insecurities crept back in. The world was still a noisy place, and she was still very much in the public eye. The socialites who had criticized her at the gala continued to make snide remarks, and the media wasn't shy about keeping up the narrative they had painted of her. But Sandra wasn't ready to give in to the pressure anymore. The fear that had once paralyzed her was no longer a constant companion. She had begun to trust that the path she was walking now was the right one for her. One afternoon, as she sat in her favorite coffee shop, catching up on a book she had started weeks ago, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Keanu. "Hey, Sandra. I've been thinking about you. I know things aren't easy, but you've got this. You're not alone in this journey. I'm proud of the steps you've taken so far. Don't forget to keep going at your own pace. We've got one life to live, and it's time we live it the way we want. Take care. Keanu." She smiled softly at the message. It wasn't just a text, it was a reminder. A reminder that she wasn't just an actress, a public figure, or a product of the industry. She was a person with her own desires, fears, and dreams. She didn't have to fit anyone's mold. Not anymore. Sandra put her phone down and took a deep breath, allowing herself to feel the weight of the words. She wasn't alone. She wasn't trapped in the expectations that had once defined her. She had the power to shape her future, to create a life that was her own. The next few weeks were a blend of quiet reflection and small steps forward. Sandra continued to take time for herself, but she also took her first steps toward reclaiming her career on her own terms. She agreed to meet with a director she admired, not because she felt pressured, but because she genuinely wanted to explore a role that resonated with her values. She didn't care about the size of the role or the recognition, it was about doing something that felt authentic. One afternoon, as she sat in the director's office, she realized just how much she had changed. The nervousness she would have once felt in this situation was gone. She didn't need validation from anyone. She just needed to follow her heart, and that was enough. The director noticed the shift in her demeanor. "Sandra," he said with a smile, "there's something different about you. I've worked with a lot of actors, but I can see that you're coming from a deeper place now. You're more grounded." Sandra returned his smile, the weight of the words hitting her in a way that was both humbling and empowering. "Thank you," she said. "I've been learning to let go of the noise. It's not about the recognition anymore. It's about doing work that matters to me." The director nodded, clearly impressed. "That's the kind of energy I want on set. Let's make something real." In that moment, Sandra knew that she had found something greater than the fame and recognition she had once chased. She had found her voice. Her purpose. It was no longer about the glamorous facade. It was about the work that came from the heart. And that was more rewarding than any red carpet moment or award. The phone call with Keanu came later that evening. After catching up, they talked about life, careers, and the ways in which they had both evolved. "I'm really proud of you, Sandra," Keanu said, his voice warm and sincere. "I can see the change in you, and it's inspiring." Sandra felt her heart swell with gratitude. Keanu's support had been unwavering, and that had made all the difference. He hadn't just been there when things were tough, he had believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. "I couldn't have done it without you," Sandra said, her voice thick with emotion. "You helped me see something I couldn't see before. You made me realize that it's okay to be real. To not have all the answers, and to embrace the journey, no matter where it takes me." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Keanu spoke again, his tone softer now. "You're never alone, Sandra. You never have been." The words settled deep within her, filling the empty spaces she hadn't realized existed. She wasn't just taking steps forward in her career, she was stepping into a new version of herself, one that embraced vulnerability, authenticity, and freedom. And as Sandra sat there, reflecting on everything she had gone through, the highs, the lows, and the transformative moments, she knew that she had finally found her place. She had let go of the expectations. She had broken free from the judgment. And now, she was ready to live life on her own terms. No more masks. No more pretending. Just the real Sandra, unapologetically herself. And for the first time in years, Sandra felt at peace with the person she had become. Sandra stood in front of the mirror, eyes focused on the reflection staring back at her. She had always been a creature of habit, but today was different. The woman she saw in the mirror wasn't the same one who had walked the red carpet months ago, caught in the whirlwind of Hollywood's expectations. The reflection now looked calm, grounded, free. She had shed the layers of armor she'd built around herself for protection, and for the first time, she felt like she was finally breathing in her own skin. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her reverie. It was a text from Keanu, as it had been on and off over the past few weeks. Their conversations had become a routine, but one that felt more like an anchor than an obligation. "Have you thought about what we talked about?" Keanu's message read. Sandra's fingers hovered over the screen as she considered how to respond. They had spoken a lot about taking risks, breaking free from the shackles of public expectation, and stepping into uncharted territory. She had taken a break from her usual high-profile projects, but Keanu's words had stuck with her. It's time to live the life you truly want, not the one people tell you to have. She typed back quickly, "I have. And I think I'm ready." She sent the message and put her phone down. This decision wasn't just about a career shift, it was about redefining herself from the inside out. Sandra had learned over the past few months that fame wasn't everything. The moments with Keanu, where they could simply be people, free of their public personas, had been a revelation. They had shared stories of their struggles, their self-doubt, and their desire for a life beyond the cameras. It wasn't something she was willing to give up now. The idea of stepping into more meaningful work, of pursuing projects that aligned with her values, had been terrifying at first. The thought of stepping away from the spotlight, of walking away from the machine that had made her famous, was unsettling. But now, the excitement was starting to outweigh the fear. Sandra decided to take a meeting with the director she had met with a few weeks ago. He had offered her a role that wasn't glamorous or easy, it was raw, gritty, and emotionally demanding. But that was exactly what Sandra needed. A chance to step outside her comfort zone and challenge herself in ways she never had before. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Sandra worked tirelessly with the director, immersing herself in the character, pushing her limits, and tapping into emotions she had long buried. It wasn't just acting. It was therapy, a process of peeling back the layers she had spent so long trying to protect. But despite the hard work, Sandra couldn't shake the sense of loneliness that sometimes crept in. She had been surrounded by people her entire life, people who praised her, people who admired her, people who needed something from her, but now, she was carving out space for herself. Space where she wasn't defined by anyone else's narrative. Keanu, as always, was a steady presence. He had checked in a few times, offering encouragement and advice when she needed it. He had even shared his own experiences of stepping away from certain roles and projects, realizing that doing something truly meaningful was worth the risk of losing some fame along the way. "I know it's hard," he'd said one evening on the phone. "The world expects so much from us. But you're doing the right thing. Trust me, the right work will find you." Sandra had thanked him then, and now, as she continued working on the film, she understood exactly what he meant. The process wasn't easy, nothing about it was, but it felt right. The film was starting to take shape, and Sandra was starting to feel something she hadn't felt in years: fulfillment. It wasn't the applause or the red carpet moments she had lived for in the past. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the work was genuine and meaningful. One evening, after a long day of filming, Sandra received a message from Keanu. This time, it wasn't about career advice or encouragement. Instead, it was a simple line that made her smile: "How are you doing, really?" Sandra paused before responding, her fingers hovering over the keys. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to pretend. She wasn't just doing well on the surface, she was really doing well. Deep down, she felt connected to herself in a way she hadn't in years. She had taken a leap, and it was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. "I'm doing better than I've ever been," she typed back. There was a long pause before Keanu replied, but when he did, his words were exactly what she needed to hear. "I'm glad to hear that. Take it slow. The world will still be there when you're ready for it." Sandra smiled, her heart swelling. It was a message of patience, of living for the moment and not rushing towards some unreachable goal. He was right. She didn't have to prove anything to anyone. The world was hers to experience, not to perform for. A few weeks later, Sandra found herself on set, filming a scene that pushed her to the edge emotionally. The character she was playing was far from glamorous, but every moment felt real, every line felt raw. The sweat, the tears, the exhaustion, this was what Sandra had been looking for. This was the work that challenged her and, in turn, made her feel truly alive. As she looked around the set, she realized that this was the new chapter she had been waiting for. She had embraced her authenticity, stepped away from the expectations of others, and started doing the work that mattered most to her. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition anymore. It was about the journey, her journey, and it was just beginning. At the end of the filming day, as the crew began to pack up, Sandra felt a sense of peace wash over her. It was the kind of peace that came from living truthfully, from facing fears and embracing vulnerability. She no longer felt the need to play a part, she was finally living her own story. As she made her way back to her car, her phone buzzed again. It was another message from Keanu. "Sending you some good vibes. I'm proud of the woman you're becoming." Sandra's heart skipped a beat. His words, simple, heartfelt, had been the steady thread weaving through her transformation. And now, as she read those words, she knew that the journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. She put the phone down, smiling to herself. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. And for once, that was enough. Sandra stood on the edge of the film set, the sun beginning to set behind the towering city skyline. It had been a year since the Gala incident, and the shift in her life had been nothing short of monumental. Her world had changed in ways she hadn't expected. No longer was she the actress hiding behind a public persona, constantly trying to please the world and stay relevant. No, now she was Sandra, unfiltered, unapologetic, and finally comfortable with her own truths. Her latest film was well into post-production, and the early reviews were already rolling in. The word masterpiece was being tossed around, a stark contrast to the superficial buzz that once followed her every move. Critics were praising her for the depth and rawness she brought to her character. It was as though the world had finally stopped judging her by the superficial standards of Hollywood, and started seeing the real Sandra, the woman who wasn't afraid to expose her vulnerabilities. As the evening drew to a close, Sandra stood with Keanu on the quiet, nearly empty set. The two had grown closer over the past year, supporting each other through personal and professional changes. Keanu had already wrapped his own film project, but had stuck around to offer advice and be a sounding board as Sandra navigated this new chapter. Their friendship had become a quiet force of support in an industry that often thrived on chaos. "You know," Keanu said, leaning against a prop car, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. It's incredible how you've embraced all the change. It's not easy, you know." Sandra smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with warmth. "No, it's not easy. But it's worth it. I'm finally doing something that feels real. It's not about the fame or the glamorous roles anymore. It's about finding something that challenges me, that pushes me to grow. It's about doing work I believe in. Work that means something." Keanu nodded, his eyes reflecting the same quiet understanding. "I get it. I've been there, too. But not everyone has the strength to make that shift. It's brave. You're brave. Sandra was silent for a moment, her mind drifting to the lessons she had learned over the past year. She thought about the gala, the harsh words from the socialites, the public embarrassment, and how it all seemed so trivial now in comparison to the inner peace she'd found. The lessons hadn't come easy, but they had been necessary. She had learned that no one could define her but herself. She had learned that failure wasn't the end of the world, but rather an invitation to reinvent herself. She had learned that true strength came not from hiding behind a mask of perfection but from facing her flaws and imperfections head-on. She turned to Keanu, her voice steady. I couldn't have done it without you, Keanu. You've been a constant source of support, even when I didn't ask for it. I don't think I could have taken this leap without having you in my corner. Keanu gave a small smile, but it was full of meaning. It's been an honor to watch you evolve. You've got an incredible future ahead of you, Sandra. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. Sandra's phone buzzed, snapping her out of her reverie. It was a notification from her publicist. The film's premiere was in 2 weeks, and a massive gala was scheduled to celebrate the launch. The same type of event that had once made her cringe in anticipation. But this time, it was different. This time, Sandra was attending as her true self, unpolished, imperfect, and fully confident in the work she had created. Looks like it's time to get ready for the big night, she said, showing the message to Keanu. I think this time I'm going to do things differently. Keanu raised an eyebrow, his smile turning mischievous. Different? How so? Sandra laughed. I'm not going to play it safe. I'm going to show up as me. No more pretending to be someone I'm not. I'm not just going to sit there and let others talk about me. I'm going to own the conversation. Keanu grinned. I'm in. I think you'll blow them away. The night of the premiere arrived quickly, and as Sandra stood in front of the grand venue, the weight of her decision settled into her chest. The flashing lights from photographers illuminated the street in a stark contrast to the calm she had come to find within herself. It was the same red carpet she had walked down so many times before, but this time, there was no sense of dread. No anxiety. Just clarity. Her outfit, unlike the carefully curated gowns of previous premieres, was an expression of who she was. She wore something simple, a tailored black suit, minimalist and clean. No dazzling diamonds, no sparkling dresses. Just Sandra, standing tall, unafraid to be herself. As she stepped onto the carpet, the cameras turned toward her, and the questions began, just like always. But this time, she wasn't the one trying to craft the perfect soundbite. She was answering with honesty, speaking from the heart, and sharing the journey she had been on. How does it feel to be back on the red carpet, Sandra? A reporter asked. She smiled. It feels like I'm finally stepping into my own. It feels like I'm showing up as myself for the first time in a long time. Another reporter, sensing the shift, asked, what made you decide to take a break from Hollywood and come back with such a bold choice? Sandra's eyes softened. I didn't take a break. I just needed to remember who I was before the cameras and the lights. I needed to remember that I'm not defined by what the world wants me to be. I'm defined by who I am at my core. And now, I'm finally doing the kind of work that reflects that. The questions continued, but Sandra felt no pressure. She wasn't performing for anyone. She was simply sharing her truth with the world. The evening ended with the premiere screening, and Sandra watched her film unfold on the big screen, feeling a quiet satisfaction at every frame. She could feel the weight of the years spent pretending, trying to live up to the world's standards, lifting off of her shoulders. This film, this role, was hers in a way that none of her past works had been. It was hers because she had allowed herself to be vulnerable. She had allowed herself to be real. As the credits rolled, Sandra stood up, applause ringing in her ears, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to rush out of the theater, to escape the attention. Instead, she soaked in the moment. She had done it. She had come full circle. Keanu stood beside her, smiling with pride. You did it. Sandra looked at him, her heart full. I couldn't have done it without you, Keanu. He winked at her. You did the hard part. You took the leap. I just reminded you that you were always meant to fly. Sandra smiled as she looked out at the applause. Tonight, she wasn't just an actress. She was a woman who had finally found her voice. And that was enough. The months after the premiere seemed to fly by in a whirlwind. Sandra's film had been hailed as a career-defining performance, and the accolades were rolling in from all corners of the industry. Critics praised her ability to transform herself into a character so vulnerable and raw that it left the audience questioning everything they knew about her. But for Sandra, the real reward wasn't the praise, it was the personal evolution she had undergone to get to this point. Her days were no longer filled with endless meetings, endless appearances, and endless pressure to maintain the facade that she had been living under for so long. Instead, she found herself waking up to a life that felt more like a dream, a life where she had the freedom to choose the roles she wanted, the projects that challenged her, and the people she surrounded herself with. One morning, as Sandra sipped her coffee on the balcony of her New York apartment, she received a message that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in her journey. It was from her manager, with a subject line that caught her eye: a new opportunity, your next project. She opened the email, which contained a brief but intriguing note from a renowned filmmaker who had seen her recent work and wanted to offer her a leading role in a socially impactful project. The project was ambitious, diving into themes of identity, healing, and redemption. The director had a reputation for tackling sensitive subjects with grace and depth, and this project was no exception. It would require Sandra to dig even deeper into herself than she ever had before. But it wasn't the role that made Sandra pause, it was the recognition that she was no longer afraid of taking on difficult roles, nor was she afraid of diving into tough subjects that made people uncomfortable. She had embraced change, learned to speak her truth, and now, she had the chance to do even more. To share her story in a way that mattered, to create art that spoke to the human experience. She quickly typed a response: I'm in. Let's make this happen. The opportunity marked the beginning of a new phase for Sandra. One where she didn't shy away from challenging work or uncomfortable truths. Her focus was no longer on what was expected of her but on what she wanted to say through her art. It was about making an impact. About leaving a legacy of truth and authenticity, not just another string of successful films that everyone would forget in a few years. As she signed on to the project, Sandra began to reflect on the years she had spent in the industry, the pressure, the public image, the fear of failure, and the constant need for validation. She thought about the socialites at the gala, the way they had ruthlessly criticized her, and how, in that moment, it had felt like the end of the world. But looking back, she realized that it had been the beginning of something much more profound. It had been the spark that ignited her journey of self-discovery. The phone call with Keanu that followed was a celebration in itself. The two of them had spent so much time encouraging each other, giving each other the space to grow. Keanu had been through his own transformation in recent years, stepping away from roles that didn't serve him, and now, both of them were working toward projects that resonated with their true selves. You're going to be incredible in this new project, Keanu said, his voice filled with pride. Sandra smiled. I'm ready for it. It's time for me to do work that feels like it matters. I'm not just looking for applause anymore. I want to do something that leaves an impact. Keanu chuckled softly. That's the Sandra I know. Always pushing boundaries. As the months passed, Sandra dove headfirst into the new project. She poured herself into the character, allowing herself to explore the depths of human emotion, identity, and resilience. The work was challenging, demanding every ounce of emotional energy she had. But it was exactly what she needed, an opportunity to prove to herself that she could do more than just play a role. She could embody it, breathe life into it, and give it meaning. On set, Sandra became a beacon of leadership. She didn't just inspire her fellow actors with her dedication to the craft, she created an atmosphere of openness, honesty, and vulnerability. She had learned that the true power of storytelling came from a place of shared experience, where everyone on set was united by the same goal, to create something real, something that resonated. The film, when it was finally released, was met with critical acclaim and audience admiration. It sparked conversations about healing and redemption, about the power of self-acceptance and forgiveness. And through it all, Sandra's performance stood out as one of her finest works, a testament to everything she had overcome and the person she had become. As the film's success grew, Sandra found herself on stage again, accepting awards. But this time, when she stepped up to the microphone, she wasn't just delivering a scripted speech. She spoke from the heart, reflecting on her journey and the lessons she had learned along the way. "I spent so many years living a life that wasn't truly mine," Sandra said, her voice steady but emotional. "I allowed the world to define who I was and what I should be. But I've learned that the only person I need to answer to is myself. I've learned that we all have the power to redefine our lives, no matter where we start. And if there's anything I've learned, it's that we all deserve to live truthfully, unapologetically, and with love in our hearts." The applause that followed was deafening, but Sandra didn't care about the noise anymore. She knew her journey had come full circle. The woman she was today wasn't the one who had walked the red carpet years ago. She was someone stronger, wiser, and more real than ever before. Keanu's words echoed in her mind as she stood on that stage, "The right work will find you." And indeed, it had. Sandra wasn't just an actress anymore. She was a woman who had found her voice, embraced her flaws, and fought for the life she deserved. And in doing so, she had created a legacy that would inspire others to do the same. As the night ended, Sandra left the stage, smiling to herself. Her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. But now, she was ready for whatever came next, knowing that, no matter what, she would always be true to herself. And that, she realized, was the greatest role she could ever play.